Hello and welcome, I'm Dr. Newman, and today I'm going to be talking about the connection between religion and politics in the 1500s, especially in England. Content advisory: this lecture, the slides will feature some slightly weird AI art. I think there was the right number of fingers on each of the historical figures painted here, and to those of you who are professional illustrators, that I didn't pay, I apologize. I wasn't going to pay you anyway. I hope this art doesn't steal yours. I was wanting to get these slides together in a hurry because I'm teaching a course right now that will use this lecture, and there's a website called Gamma AI that allows you to take your lecture notes, which I built up over the years, and turn them instantly into a PowerPoint. Not my favorite thing to do because I actually really enjoy making my PowerPoints. It's kind of it's an arts and crafts project for me, but I'm going for speed here, not quality, which is really part of the problem of our civilization, isn't it? All right, to business. Let's talk about religion and politics in early modern England. We'll examine key figures, theological debates, and political changes that shaped this tumultuous period in English history. And the first key event, of course, that needs to be talked about is the Protestant Reformation, which began when an Augustinian canon named Martin Luther. An Augustinian canon was a type of monk, somebody who took vows of poverty and chastity and obedience to the church, was really, really distressed about how his soul might be saved. The word in theology that's used to describe the theological investigation of salvation is soteriology. And so Martin Luther was really interested in soteriology, and a lot of the struggles and debates in the coming century, not just between Protestants, because they protested against the Catholic Church, and Catholics, but also between different kinds of Protestants, were based on soteriology, and on the basic question, how may I be saved? Martin Luther came to believe, based on his understanding of Scripture, that one was not justified through masses or prayers or the sacrament or the Eucharist or any of these practices that the Catholic Church had cultivated over the centuries, which it referred to as works, the opus dei, the works of God, but by faith alone. Consequent to this argument, he also argued that any believer can understand Scripture through the illumination of their understanding by the Holy Spirit. They don't need the magisterium of Rome to decide on what the acceptable interpretations are. This opened the floodgate for scores of breakaway sects. The Anabaptists, the Calvins, the Arminians, the Anglicans would come, all these different groups. Check out the Munster Rebellion of like 1541. It's like this crazy apocalyptic cult that takes over an entire city, and the rest of Germany puts it under siege. Even Martin Luther is like, I got nothing to do with these guys. Crazy stuff. But forget about Munster right now. Let's talk about Thomas More, who was the Archbishop, is the Cardinal in England and the Chancellor of Henry VIII, who was totally against all this. He says that if we abandon the authority of Rome, it'll completely break the Christian community. It'll break it all apart, and we won't have Christian unity anymore. To which the Calvinist, the Baptist, the Anabaptist, whoever else might argue back and say, we're not fractured. We, the faithful remnant, our little group is intact and whole, and the rest of you aren't even Christian. You belong to the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so the unity of the Christian church fell apart. Oddly enough, Henry VIII was originally just totally pro-Catholic, anti-Protestant. And Thomas More wrote arguments against Martin Luther, ghost wrote them for Henry VIII, for which Henry VIII got the title Defender of the Faith, which he kept even after he ended up breaking with the Pope and starting his own version of Christianity, which, when he undertook it, was basically Catholicism without the Pope, because he liked the hierarchical structure, but he didn't like the fact that he wasn't at the top of that hierarchical structure. That's my take anyway. Something very important to Marlowe's Dr. Faustus and Milton's Milton's Paradise Lost, and other important works of the period was the debate between two kinds of Protestants, Calvinists versus Arminians. The Calvinists believed that everything was predestined by God, who was saved and who wasn't. Modern Presbyterians are descended through Scots theologians like John Knox from the French Christian Protestant John Calvin. Arminians, on the other hand, believed in free will, that God had granted free will, and they were close to each other in their beliefs, except for this one important distinction for which people burned each other. Anyway, let's talk about the political history that's going on alongside these religious changes that are rollicking through the 1500s. In the government, we have a power shifting from feudal lords to absolute monarchs more and more. We have increasingly have centralized authority in the crown. In terms of economy, we have an accelerating transition from land-based wealth to mercantile wealth, and this will fuel exploration and trade. In terms of the military, we have a transition from feudal warriors who fight for honor and glory to professional soldiers as warfare modernizes with the increasingly equalizing role of gunpowder and the ability to coordinate state power on a high level, right? You may be the best knight in the world. You get shot in the face with a musket by a peasant, you're going down. Now again, this is just accelerating stuff that was already happening. Like in the late Middle Ages, you get the crossbow, which is similarly, though with less power, democratizing in terms of who can kill who. So these are all things that are happening during the 1500s that are transforming the world and are taking us out of the medieval and into the early modern. In religion, of course, we have a transition from a universal pope church under the pope to, on the one hand, mostly in Southern Europe and much of Central Europe, Roman Catholicism, and across Northern Europe especially, competing stripes of Protestantism, based in Geneva, but also in Wittenberg and other centers of learning in the north of Europe. You have various kinds of Protestantism and various state powers who don't want to be under the authority of a pope all the way in Italy give political support to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is also aided by the development of the printing press, which means that dissenting ideas can be disseminated rapidly and widely. This is also the period in the second half of the 1500s where we have the birth of the professional theater, the Elizabethan theater, just as we talk about in another video, which I encourage you to watch on the origins and sources of Shakespeare's theater. And so it's during this time of really radical change in so many things that we get, first of all, Henry VIII and the break with Rome. Let's focus it back on England. Henry VIII, who is the son of Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who restored authority of the crown and a unified throne in England after something like 40 years of civil war. He wasn't even supposed to be the king. His older brother was, but he died young. And so Henry VIII takes over and inherits his brother's fiancée. I know that's kind of weird, but you know, when it's a matter of alliance between England and Spain, the show must go on, right? And so Henry VIII's long reign saw significant religious and political changes in England. He introduced a more absolute kind of monarchy, challenging traditional power structures. He ended up breaking with the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England with the monarch himself as the head of the church rather than the Pope. He also, and this is interestingly, he dissolved the monasteries, which doesn't sound like a big deal. Okay, so there's a bunch of monks aren't doing monk things anymore, but the monasteries and the convents owned like 25%, to check my number, but a really, really significant portion of the land in England was owned by monastic orders. And so he takes that, personally amassing a huge amount of wealth, because most wealth still is based in land, and kind of gives it out to his friends in order to consolidate his own power. The break with Rome sparked ongoing religious strife in England that would last for generations. When he dies, he finally after, I'm not going to talk about the wives. I'm sure there's enough YouTube videos out there that you can talk about. But Anne Boleyn, who's staunch Protestant and more kind of a serious Protestant, not just like I don't like the Pope, but believes in a lot of the ideas of Luther. Her son Edward VI takes over, and he's a really intense about the Protestantism, but he dies after like as 6 years. He reigns from 1547, there we go, to 1553. And he dies without a kid because he's a teenager. It seems like he had cancer or something. It's pretty sad. And then Queen Mary I of England takes over. She runs things from 1553 to 1558. She's known by Protestants in England as Bloody Mary. She attempts to restore Catholicism, burns a bunch of religious scholars, persecutes Protestants, attempts to restore Roman Catholicism, but she dies in 1558, and she was not in power long enough for it to take, especially because her sister, another daughter of Anne Boleyn, comes to power, Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth I was a Protestant again. There's a wonderful story about her in a procession. And again, here's one of those weird AI pictures. There's a weird story about a procession. There's a good story about in a procession when she's being coronated, right? The coronation parade, where she's riding a horse towards Westminster Abbey to be crowned. And a bunch of monks friars come out, who are not the same as monks, come out with candles and offer them to her. And she rejects them and says, I don't want your candles. I can see well enough by the light of day. And so the candle is associated with Catholic ritual. And so that's her publicly signaling that she is not with the Catholics anymore. Also, she's holding a prayer book in English. And the English prayer book, a vernacular rather than a Latin prayer book, was also a sign of affiliation to Protestant Christianity rather than Catholic Christianity. Now, within the next few decades, Catholics would realize that they needed to have their own version of the Bible in the vernacular if they were going to compete, because one of the things that marks the second half of the 1500s and actually well into the 1600s is that when Catholic and Protestant powers aren't in open warfare with each other, there's a kind of Cold War situation going on. In this Cold War situation, you have agents from either side attempting to infiltrate one another, to spread propaganda. Elizabeth's spy master was constantly hunting down priests, secretly wandering down the country. And in houses in the north of England, they had secret hiding places called priest holes, where those who were still Catholic, even though it was officially illegal, would hide their priests so they could take Mass. And again, taking Mass was considered essential for that most important question and dilemma of the 1500s: how do I save my soul? So, let's talk again about Elizabeth. She eventually brings relative stability to the island of Great Britain, and this is what allows the cultural flourishing that we know of as this kind of golden age of Shakespeare and Spenser and Sidney and Marlowe and Mary Roth and all these people to take root. Let's learn a little bit more about Elizabeth. Besides the fact that she had a weird, janky AI face and was surrounded by other people with weird, terrible, uncanny valley faces. Don't know what's going on with those fingers there. Don't love it. Don't love that either. All right, back to the actual QE1. She never got married. This gave her the nickname the Virgin Queen. We're not sure why she never got married. Some people argue that it's just so she could keep power and to maintain stability. That there's a kind of nationalistic view that she didn't want to that she could only marry another king, right? Because you couldn't marry below your station. But if she were to marry a king, she would give up authority over England to a foreign ruler, right? And so she didn't want to do that. And she describes herself in her speeches as being married to England, but also seeing England as her children. She kept a pretty low profile before she came to power. She was under house arrest, kind of kept out of the way for a while. We know that she was a skilled scholar learning Italian, French, Greek, and Latin. We have poetry that survives from her. If you have an anthology of English literature, go check some out. She's actually not a bad poet and a good speechwriter. Nobody knew if she was Catholic or Protestant until she came to power. She played her cards really close to the chest. This was even her motto, which was "Video sed taceo." I see, but I am silent. During her reign, however, we see a renaissance in literature, theater, and the arts. She begins to explore, to support exploration and discovery, expanding England's global influence. In the 21st century, we don't look at that as an unqualified good, of course, because it will lead to settler colonialism and the slave trade and all that kind of stuff. But she was a really interesting and powerful woman who returned England to Protestantism and kept it that way, who cultivated a sophisticated court culture, and who really completed the transition of England being a relatively minor nation among the powers of Europe to being one of the great powers of Europe. When she hands the keys of the car over to her cousin, the Scottish king James VI, who becomes the James I Stuart of England, he's got a going concern at this point, and he is also now in a position where he's ruling both Scotland and England. So let's talk about this aspect of her reign, this religious aspect of her reign that's known as the Elizabethan settlement. The Elizabethan settlement has to do with the religious and political arrangements that worked out during the reign of Elizabeth to end the religious strife that had racked England for decades, right? During the 1540s and 1550s, you have violence, burning, persecution, martyrs on both sides. It does not make for a stable and prosperous society. So what Elizabeth does is that she outlaws Catholicism, but she tries to kind of make everyone happy by establishing a state religion that blends Reformed theology, and by Reformed I mean Lutheran, with some Catholic forms of worship, such as the maintenance of bishops and the Eucharist in a traditional form, and an order and a liturgical order of service that resembles Catholicism. So we have Catholic forms of worship with Reformed theology and a kind of deliberate vagueness about doctrines. That's trying to sort of create room for everyone to find a comfortable space in this. Of course, though, in this period, this is always true for a number of people to some extent, but in this period especially, you could not be vague about doctrine. If you're vague about doctrine, the consequences are that you could spend eternity in hell. So a lot of the Protestants and Catholics in her reign are not cool about this. So while the Elizabethan settlement sounds like it's sort of like live and let live, it's actually kind of authoritarian. She's trying to keep down the power of the Catholics on the one side, and on the other side, those who wish to further purify the Protestant church and purge it of all those lingering remnants of what they would call like popish religion or papism or any other kind of sort of anti-Catholic slander. And so those people come to be known by their enemy as Puritans, right? At a certain point, when they're not so popular, they take, and they're being persecuted, they take off to Holland. And a certain group of them are so intense that the Dutch, who are pretty far along the Puritan road themselves, are like, y'all are crazy. You need to get out of here. You can't stay here anymore. And so that group left Holland, and rather than going back to England, they went to a place called Massachusetts that they named after the town that they had left in England, which had been called Plymouth. But that's a story for another day. Getting back to Elizabeth and her settlement, she reestablishes the monarch as the supreme head of the Church of England. She maintains a kind of structure and order to the English church, the mainstream established church, and tries to stifle all dissent either on one side or the other side of the version of Christianity that she has cultivated. It will not last. In the 1600s, there will be religious civil war between the kind of high church royalists and the low church Puritans. The Puritans will win, overthrowing the monarchy and establishing a theocratic republic for 10 years. That will not be able to sustain itself, and eventually both the Church of England, in very much the form Elizabeth had put it, and the monarchy will come back in what's known as the Restoration in the 1660s. But as for Elizabeth herself, she had a good time of it. Despite putting down several rebellions against her, she managed to withstand military and political and diplomatic attacks by great powers of Europe. She established a uniquely English form of Protestantism, cake or death, a cultural golden age of theater, literature, and art flourished, producing enduring masterpieces. England begins to expand. At this point, its colonial empire is really getting into Ireland and Scotland and increasingly, and the fishing banks of Newfoundland, which are still a prize being fought over by a number of nations. And she brought, and this is one of the most important things, political stability. England as a nation kind of would survive for a while after this, despite the revolution and coups and restorations of the 17th century. So a pretty interesting person, and so I hope this helped you learn more about how the religious changes of the 1600s affected politics, which in turn informed the art and literature and culture of the period. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to get at me with them. I love to answer questions. I hope you've enjoyed this, despite the weird, creepy AI illustrations. I want to make a promise to you that I'll never use those again. Yes, I'm committing. No more creepy AI. The weird fingers and the kind of lumpy, bulbous faces. Bye.